I get it. For years, I've been saying I don't tend to idolize or harp on specific writers or directors, because a finished film is often much less a singular, complete vision than it once was. And this series is first and foremost a full-time hands-on scene analysis, part-time self-therapy session, where I care more about teaching screenwriting by example, rather than trying to fawn over professionals, because I don't necessarily think that is healthy for aspiring writers to put that weight on themselves. And even some of the greatest writer-directors of the 21st century, not you, are often more praised for their talents behind the camera, rather than with a pen and pad. I felt like I couldn't relate to these people who got so transfixed by the works of Tarantino, Coppola, Scorsese, and the like, because I felt like studying a person's body of work wouldn't necessarily be reflective of much other than their favorite genre or preferred lighting schemes or camera tricks. But then I rewatched Mike Flanagan's The Haunting of Bly Manor, and I thought, I get it. Mike Flanagan is a horror writer-director that got his start back in the early 2010s with some breakout success in his first film, Absentia, that he made for practically zero budget and got entered into the Sundance Film Festival. From there, he's bounced back and forth between the big and small screen, producing some of the best slow-burn horror of the past few years, starting with Oculus starring Karen Gillan back in 2014, before going on to make a surprisingly good prequel-sequel to the movie Ouija, and then partnering with Netflix for a series of films and TV shows including Before I Wake, Gerald's Game, Hush, Haunting of Hill House, and of course Haunting of Bly Manor. Flanagan is partly known for his tendency to return to the familiar. He often includes Easter eggs to previous works in each of his projects, and he loves to bring back the same old cast and crew. There's this sense of cohesiveness that I associate with the man. And I'm not just saying that because I want to be let in his inner circle, but Mr. Flanagan, if you are somehow seeing this, I'd make a great PA. I can also hold a boom mic really well. Just ask my friends, please. I want to be in the room where it happens. I'm saying this because Flanagan as a writer has been working around the same themes for the entirety of his horror career. Not in a way that would make him a one-trick pony, just reusing imagery and plot points, you pretentious sadomasochist. I only really started to notice this far into my binge of Bly Manor, even though Flanagan said he was inspired by a myriad of Henry James's short stories, and wanted to structure each episode as to tell a sort of micro-story in and of itself. You still start to see those trademark Flanaganisms come through. All these bits and pieces of themes intertwining into this larger story. Like when the first big twist came up of the non-linearity of the timeline, or this motif of hauntings as dreamlike loops, trapped inside memories, I thought, And then this random line happened.
The forever house.
And I went, This isn't lazy, and it's not an accident. I want to know why Flanagan continues to reference the same material, and what he's trying to say about where true horror lies. So without further ado, this is Mike Flanagan. Flanagan has said in interviews that he got his start in editing, specifically for reality television. He's spoken about working in a time before nonlinear editing, and how forcing himself to organize and edit in his head made him more deliberate in his choices as both a writer and director. As far back as Oculus in 2014, he's been playing with flashbacks and merging timelines as a means of reshaping your typical ghost story. Because let's be honest for a second, if I tried to describe to you on a surface level Flanagan's filmography, you'd be hard-pressed to say it was anything remotely groundbreaking. Absentia, for instance, is about a monster in a tunnel that kidnaps people. Oculus is about a haunted mirror that tries to kill you. Ouija 2, that's just another Ouija movie. Before I Awake is about a boy's nightmares that come to life. Hill House is about an old haunted house, yada 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 yada. But it's his approach to the timeline that keeps the beats from playing out how you expect. There's this almost dreamlike quality to the way Flanagan plays with time, creating the sense of unfamiliarity and uncertainty, despite often going in with a simple premise. Two settings will sometimes mold into one, or characters will interact with their past selves in the same frame, or watch the scene play out as if it were a memory, bleeding into the present without jerking us into the earlier or later timeline. Flanagan also heavily relies on editing tricks like match cuts or J&L cuts with the audio to keep his continuum of story moving forward, not giving any of us a break to pause Netflix and get up. Sometimes he likes to resort to more classic editing techniques like long dissolves, or adding a cigarette burn in the corner of the frame to create a more familiar vibe on modern audiences, while still staying true to the authentic look of some of his period pieces. All in all, it creates this almost ethereal, Lovecraftian feel to the world of the supernatural. Simple concepts of past and present are categorized as vague ideas of then and now, and points in time and even whole people are tucked inside another memory. There's nothing concrete laid out in front of the audience to easily understand. Information is given piecemeal by Flanagan, while still adhering to traditional structure. In his bigger ensemble pieces, we often see the same events in upwards of 5 different ways, each new entry revealing crucial minutes either before or after what we've already seen. In his longer works like Hill House and Bly Manor, episodes are structured between past and present in a way that feels like a character's memory. Using editing techniques previously mentioned, as Flanagan has said before, he shows how past and present often echo each other. It feels like characters are literally haunted by those moments in time. More on that in a bit. And we see how they actively influence the present story. The trouble with flashbacks is the balance of delivering necessary exposition and character motivation without feeling tacked on, like this couldn't have been accomplished in the present. But the end effect Flanagan achieves is that time isn't just non-linear. It's not just about then and now. Oftentimes history can repeat itself, or destiny is written from the start. The Flanagan timeline is something inescapable, mysterious, figurative. It's...
Our moments fall around us like rain.
Exactly. The supernatural rarely adheres to something conventional in his work. And of course, there's naturally a lot of caveats people have to jump over before any of these things become super accessible. But I've learned that the specifics aren't important here. He creates this feeling as his stories start that leave me unsettled, and one step behind the filmmaker at every step of the way. It's this lovely little trance that I fall into, and that's something my stupid 23-year-old analytical film brain can rarely do anymore. At this point, I could cave and resort to just shilling about how much I love Hill House, but I wanted to do my due diligence first by backing up my points with other sources. Judging by my script length, I'm only about halfway through the video, and the intrusive introspective thoughts don't usually start breaking through into the third act, so let's keep going. Keeping with that ethereal touch, there's something to Flanagan's dialogue that fits into that uncanny, dreamlike quality. The best way I can describe it is soap operatic. You see, Flanagan is notorious for not shooting coverage on long monologues, in an effort to force his producers and editors to let him hold on his characters for longer periods of time. And in doing so, he must either move the action forward with a distinct movement, or with dialogue. And his writing is weird. The way he presents his stories is weird. And not in that sort of Stephen King It reboot, throw anything against the wall and see what sticks kind of weird. But hell, he does that better too. When making Dr. Sleep, he stayed true to King's original vision while adhering to being a sequel to Kubrick's landmark film. He kept within a streamlined continuity of the previous film, but instead opted to tell a story about redemption, much in line with how King wrote the original book, and bringing back the ending of the original Shining novel. In an interview with Slash Film, Flanagan said, "As many liberties as he took with it, he made a film that has profoundly formed me and has shaped the way I see cinema. And will always." That was the hope. Not to say, this was right or this was wrong, or this was the real Shining and this isn't. It was more to try and pull all of that together and celebrate all of it. His filmography is a perfect example of how the horror genre is literally just a hyperbolic evolution of a more restrained genre. And at the heart of each of his films is a family drama, heightened by some supernatural framing device. This genre is able to suspend an audience's disbelief to a much higher degree. And so characters talk in these long monologues, speaking in heavy metaphors strung together by a thread. Their language builds and builds in its complexity, to the point that it feels like time suspends until they finish a thought. They speak of everything from heaven and hell and the beyond, to things like blueberries and padded, puffy envelopes. It's a manner of speech that is unnatural. They speak in ways and outright state feelings that if it were real life, you and I would probably laugh at them. But Flanagan's characters are allowed that bizarre quirk. It's almost cathartic to watch someone so concentrated in expressing their inner thoughts and emotions, saying the same things it has taken me years to self-actualize, or plainly just speak their mind uninhibited, either by themselves or someone else. Flanagan's pacing is deliberate, as I already covered, and his characters' emotions flow like water. It's the moments in between the monologues, monologues where Flanagan's prowess for the horror really shines. It's this stuff, this bouncing around of thoughts, that allows the horror to linger. It never gets a moment to cool off. It's just this constant mounting anxiety. A powder keg that, when it explodes, it's almost tragic. So much pain, so much unsaid in the dodgy monologues and missed calls and secrets kept and the accusations. When you finally get the chance to fight past the barriers the supernatural put up, it's too late. And it reflects right back onto you. Okay, now let's talk about Hill House. This show is everything Mike Flanagan does right, all in one spot. In my eyes, it's perfection. I initially heard about Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House from a trailer on YouTube, and it naturally piqued my interest. That and the first Stranger Things trailer were two of the very few instances where I saw Netflix really trying to sell a supernatural show to garner wide appeal. But I'm not the type to obsessively hype up something before release, or dig into everything I can before I watch it. So a couple of weeks went by, and the cliche musical stings and the vaguely scary imagery didn't stick. It wasn't until a glowing recommendation from a friend on a set that I gave it a shot. Grabbed some dinner while the intro played, and then it literally took me 3 episodes to realize this was done by Flanagan. It was everything I've said up to this point that gave it away. Not to mention the distinctly muted dark blue/green color grade, and recurring actors like Henry Thomas, Elizabeth Reeser, and his lovely wife, Kate Siegel. That's when I knew that Flanagan had made his mark as a distinct force in the horror genre. And I believe it's with Hill House that Flanagan first truly got the chance to prioritize character drama over the horror elements. To get everyone on the same page, The Haunting of Hill House is derived from Shirley Jackson's 1959 novel of the same name. Its most faithful adaptation followed a group of 4 strangers, many of which share the names with the Crane family in Flanagan's adaptation, as they are invited to partake in a dinner to investigate the supernatural occurrings at the famed Hill House. There's Dr. John Montague, a paranormal investigator, Eleanor Vance, a bit of an introvert trying to escape the grasp of her mother, whom she tends for, Theodora, a promiscuous artist of sorts, and Luke Sanderson, the young heir to Hill House, who is essentially, he's a frat guy.
You're like a frat guy.
As the night goes on, more and more supernatural happenings start to occur, and the film ends with Eleanor Vance fleeing the house after seemingly endangering her own life, and crashing into a tree on the property that one of the house's original owners died at years and years ago, leaving it ambiguous as to whether this was a mere coincidence or fate. These early adaptations were heralded as proto-feminist literature that highlighted often undiscussed women's issues like mental health and autonomy, and it's Eleanor's connection to the house and an implied communion with the spirits that alienates her from the rest of the group, and she's exiled because they refuse to understand her, dismissing her as a kook. The 2018 version shifted some pieces around to tell the story of the Crane family. Husband and wife Hugh and Olivia, and 5 children, Stephen, the oldest, followed by Shirley, Theo, and twins Luke and Nell. We start in the past with them moving into Hill House for the summer to flip it for enough cash to buy what Olivia calls their forever house. However, this all gets put in jeopardy when ghosts of the house start to gain influence over Olivia, and long story short, convince her to try and kill her own children. She invites Luke and Nell upstairs for a tea party and intends to poison them when they take a drink. Hugh, however, comes in just in time and rescues the kids as Olivia falls victim to the house's tricks and kills herself. Years later, the Cranes have all gone their separate ways. Hugh barely sees his kids after losing custody because he refused to tell the truth about what happened to Olivia, in essence losing the kids' trust, when his name is slandered in the tabloids. Crazed father who killed his wife in a haunted house. Stephen grows up to be a writer who got famous for publishing his first book, a recollection of his time at Hill House, despite not believing in any ghosts. And in doing so, he's made an enemy of the rest of his siblings for profiting off of their traumatic past. He renounces everything that happened at Hill House as a crazy delusion that drove his own mother to commit suicide, and he fears so much that he would turn out the same way that he gets a vasectomy, ensuring that he does not pass on the mental illness to his own children. Shirley looks like she's got it off easy. She's married with 2 kids, and is the director of a funeral home. She's cold and controlling, and she's cutting funeral costs down to being pretty much pro bono, as if helping these families on the worst day of their life is her way of coping with the loss of her mother, after she'd nearly refused to see her mother at the funeral. Oh, and she's hiding an old affair from her husband.
Fuck you!
she's a bit much. Theo lives in Shirley's garage and is practicing as a child psychologist. He uses her psychic touch powers to sense feelings and spirits. It's a Crane girl thing, don't worry about it too much. Luke is a heroin addict that's in and out of rehab because he still sees ghosts from his time at Hill House. He has been dealing with this invisible connection to Nell that they call the twin thing, where they can sense when the other is in danger. And Nell, she's doing great. She has a wonderful husband and a strong connection to her brother, and... Oh, yeah. She's also been tormented by the vision of a shadowy figure since she was a kid, which she calls the Bent Neck Lady. She experiences these horrible bouts of sleep paralysis, as this demon seems to taunt her from the corner. She's forced to watch as her loving husband suffers a brain aneurysm and dies on her bedroom floor, as she's literally frozen, helpless to do anything. Her family essentially keeps her brother locked in a rehab, away from seeing her even on her wedding day, with no one to talk to as this spectral presence continues to invade her every thought. And as her life spirals further and further into chaos and misery, and none of her family answers her calls for help, she's led by the ghosts of the house back to where it all began, for a moment of solace. Where the house is no longer rotting, it has returned to its former glory. Specters of the house take the forms of the entire Crane family and her deceased husband. They give her everything she's been lacking in her life, and tell her everything she needed to hear, right before she's tricked into a noose, and she's pushed off the railing on the top of the spiral staircase and hangs to her death, in turn fulfilling the role she was prophesied to fill since her first night at Hill House. That is the real starting point of the story in the present day, as the family regroups to mourn her loss and come to terms with the family trauma and the lies and the resentment and the distrust that was born after their fateful stay in Hill House. So yeah, pretty simple. I'm sorry for anyone who actually just listened to that long-winded synopsis from a guy who thought peppering the last third of his script with a giant exposition dump was a good idea, but I wanted to try and replicate a fraction of the stress and complexity of this dense family dynamic Flanagan introduces here, so I can talk about how it transforms. There's so many intricacies interwoven into these 10 episodes, and I still highly encourage you to seek them out. But anyway, I say all that to say that in Flanagan's world, the supernatural element is clearly less important than any immediate family drama. His premises often start out in the fallout of some tragic supernatural event. He said himself how, especially now with the Haunting anthology, he wants his ghost to serve as an expression of emotional wounds.
I really wanted to play more with ghosts as an expression of emotional wounds that we do carry around. How the past and present can echo each other, that moments don't fall like dominoes, they fall like confetti. The Haunting of Hill House is about a very tight family, and Bly Manor is about strangers, a family that is created.
This show was sold on the premise of two timelines, blurring the actual events of that fateful night across several varying perspectives. Match cuts from past to present, shifting from Boston to California in a blink, its structure mimicking the labyrinthian layout of the house itself. Each of these terribly flawed idiots is suffering from the same unbelievable trauma, and rather than trying to work through it, they each chose to instead butt heads, and with this self-righteous attitude that they're the only one that got out of the house untouched. Stephen is so deep in his denial that he's now fighting with his wife, after he kept the secret of his vasectomy for so long, and they tried for a child for years. Throughout his episode, Luke grows colder and colder as he's kicked out of his rehab facility, feeling shivers on the back of his neck. But really, that's just the twin thing, him feeling Nell's dead body growing colder and colder as she continues to hang from the rafters of Hill House. He's been denied that truth for decades. All the ghosts and trauma in his adult life are blamed on his drug addiction. The two people in the Crane family that could probably understand each other the best, intentionally kept away from each other because those who are older and knew better. Shirley works in the basement in a funeral home surrounded by dead bodies, her equals, as she's the one doing most of the cutting out of everyone's lives. Thea wears gloves so she doesn't have to feel other people's emotions, only taking them off to get a quick fix. We're made to perceive Hugh as his horrible father and possible murderer because of the way that the night unfolds in front of us. Everything from the bandaged hand to the bloody shirt, and quick exit seeming to damn him for his crimes. But in reality, in his words, He was just trying to keep the doors of Hill House shut with both hands, leaving no room to hold his children. And you know what? Screw the analysis. This show is sad. At its core, it is a sad, sad show about sad, desperate people trying their best to make sense of the incomplete truths in their heads. We barely get the right to see Olivia as nothing more than an urban legend, her death being the fuel for campfire stories. The first time their actions are ever fully put into question comes in episode 6, Two Storms, which plays out in 4 continuous long takes, showing in real time the Cranes regrouping at Nell's wake for the first time in years. Flanagan said in the commentary for this episode that he wanted to capture the sort of heightened reality of someone going through a profound loss. And he does so using all of his trademark tools. These long, rambling monologues and shouting matches and revelations about secrets, and at the end of it all, nobody's any closer to coming to an understanding. Theo's kicked out because Shirley made an assumption about her presumed infidelity. Stephen resents his father. Luke is pulled closer and closer to returning to Hill House just like Nell. All the while, Nell is just there. The past storyline where Nell goes missing from plain sight during a horrible storm is perfect, too, as young Nell is chased down by the bent neck lady while the rest of the family runs around the house trying to fix the power. Everything merges in the present where another storm kills the power, and Nell's casket falls over, staggering the arguing Crane family into stunned silence.
Your problem is you think you know what happened that night. You don't know what guy that the wrong parent died!
They all wordlessly set the casket flat on the ground and almost immediately shuffle out the door, calling it a night. But just as Luke's about to leave, he turns back to look at his twin one last time, as this haunting line from young Nell plays over the scene.
I was right here the whole time. None of you could see me. Nobody could see me.
I think about that scene probably once a day. That line is the thesis of the show. It's the complete turning point for the rest of the show, where you see where everything is supposed to be headed. Each of the siblings was so caught up in justifying themselves and condemning their brothers and sisters that it allowed the house to take Nell without notice, like a thief in the night dragging her back into the shadows at approximately 3:03 a.m. And she both literally and figuratively is forced to live in the memories of Hill House forever. Side note, Victoria Pedretti, I hope you know how much crying you've caused me because of the rawness of this performance, of someone so innocent yet ill-equipped to handle the torment bestowed upon her. Great work. But it can also apply to each and every member of this twisted family. They can't see each other. The Cranes are no better off together than they were apart. But it's in these next couple of episodes where they reach the third act, and they're forced to act to save another member of the Crane family from succumbing to the house. And in doing so, they heal. They confront what they're running from and come to terms with it. They end up in the infamous Red Room, a room that was always locked from the inside, and twisted into different rooms to fit whoever it welcomed inside, making them acquiesce as it sunk its claws into them and started to digest them. But instead, it's now a dead, decaying husk, just like the rest of the house. They all become trapped in these worlds of their own worst fears. Stephen sees his wife in the twisted fetus of their baby that never was. Shirley relives the night that she cheated on her husband with Nathan from One Tree Hill. That's not the important part of that, but I really felt like you needed to know that. Anyway, Luke sees the eventuality of what he feared most, his very best friend from rehab overdosing in a hotel room, and him right alongside her. But just as their hallucinations are about to grab them and pull them deeper, they're awoken from this trance by the healthy-looking visage of Nell's ghost. At first, they're shocked, stunned, unsure of whether or not they should be afraid. As the silence persists, and they realize where they are, they finally begin to speak about the same things that their Hill House hallucination counterparts said to Nell before all of this happened. They apologize for yelling at her, being dishonest, discrediting her, or failing to reach out when they knew that something was wrong. She explains that no apologizing would have changed what happened, and that's just how it is sometimes. Grief and guilt is something that inherently comes with tragedy, and everyone deals with it in their own separate ways. That's an element of humanity that Flanagan has nailed down to a T. That spiraling endlessly inward, shutting others out and not even realizing the damage that you're doing because you're so self-consumed. And it's something that you can see in every single one of Flanagan's works. In Oculus, Kaylee pulls her brother back to relive the traumatic childhood just to justify her own obsession with this mirror. In Dr. Sleep, a grown-up Danny Torrance literally locks up his memories in his own head and refuses to relive what happened. And thus he falls into a world of drug addiction and violence because he won't let anybody else in. Heck, even with Hush, the reason anything happens to Maddie is because she's chosen to isolate herself after years of being deaf and mute. There's no big battle in most of Flanagan's films. At least not something super physical that ties directly into the character's fatal flaw. Instead, he prefers to tell stories that end at another starting off point. Stories that end more with a promise than a real conclusion. A promise that this is the start of the process, saying nothing fixes itself immediately, and that's perfectly fine. Sometimes it doesn't go away, and that's okay too. Sometimes you're never going to be rid of your pain. That's life. Be patient. With Flanagan, ghosts can be sad. They create this different kind of fear that lingers and grows over time. A feeling of dread where you keep pushing the inevitable further and further down the line. And these ghosts choose to come often at the most vulnerable points in a person's life. The hardest hurdle I face whenever I'm writing is managing to evoke empathy. There's this inherent mysticism to the writing process that is yet to be lost, that I'm not too keen on figuring out. I could preach all day about character flaws, setups, and payoffs or whatever else, but I can't explain what makes me cry for a dead girl in a fictional TV show. Because I've known a Nell. I've known a Theo. Hell, I've probably been a Shirley or Steven at some point. And that's okay. Flanagan spins these realistic human drama stories into a heightened, surrealist fairy tale. One in which his characters move around like chess pieces. Each move deliberate and with intention. It's accessible because of its slight disconnect from reality. And so you feel these broken people and you eventually start to see the one way to absolve them of all of their grief. And you hate that the fact that it's just 9 whole episodes of shouting, fighting the same fight, denying your feelings, succumbing to them, pushing them onto other people until tragedy forces them to act. You want to see these people get better because you want to prove that you can do the same. There's so many little details I love about this show in particular that doesn't just fit cleanly into a discussion on theme. I love the little quirks of the Crane family dynamic, like how Nell and Steven are placing bets on who was hooking up with a bridesmaid at Nell's wedding, the hug of acceptance when they see it's Theo, and the laugh of utter joy, confusion, and bafflement when she leaves. You can't just write that into a script and expect that authenticity to translate. Or the things like how it takes Luke 7 steps to get from his bed to Nell's, coinciding with his coping mechanism of counting 7 to signify each member of the family. Or another instance of the twin thing, with Nell having a bruise on her face in the morgue because Luke got beat up. I really like Luke. Or how each of the kids sees Nell's ghost wearing what they last saw her in. I love behind-the-scenes stories of how this massive project barely came together at points. Like how in the Two Storms episode, actors kept having to be hoisted around behind the camera, or had body doubles stand in for them, because they physically couldn't reach their marks on their own, whether that be due to being 4-foot-tall children, or being costumed as a ghost with glassy contacts you couldn't see 2 feet ahead of you in. Or when the dolly kept going up because it wasn't meant to work on carpet, and eventually fully broke as they finished their last take, and the actors had no clue because Flanagan feared it might affect their performance. That sort of improvisation and spontaneity is why I love filmmaking so much. And plus, it's good to know that these sorts of shenanigans never go away, even on big productions like this. This show is a treasure trove of little details, and it gets to a point where you stop looking at the details as a careful attention of a director, and eventually just as what it was meant to be. A wholly self-consistent world that exists within its own set of rules. That is straight up magic. Whereas a lot of great filmmakers try to rely on ambiguity to endlessly extend their stories' lifespans among their audiences, Flanagan instead presents it plain as day, but makes you work for a true meaning. I'm still grappling with the overall meaning of the Forever House in the new context of Bly, this seeming promise of a better place that is almost mythologized, to the point that characters seem to forget what they're actually trying to work towards. There's a lot of stuff like that he does that I honestly just don't have the energy to get into. It's currently 1 in the morning, and I can only say this show is sad in so many different ways. Flanagan's films can sometimes give off the impression that they aren't traditionally scary. If you feel that way, you're completely validated. That's what people said about Hill House when it first came out. And they said the same thing after watching Bly Manor, saying it wasn't as scary as Hill House, retroactively saying that Hill House was one of the scariest things they'd ever seen. Like, pick a battle. Personally, I think Bly Manor does a better job at intertwining the spirits into the flaws and fears of the characters, rather than making them something ancillary. I mean, without spoiling anything, just watch the first 4 episodes and see Danny's experience with the ghost in the mirror. The reveal is freaking fantastic. It's kind of obvious in hindsight, but my god, it is one of the very few times that I've wanted to go back and truly watch something again for the first time. But in terms of Hill House, Steven never even saw a ghost, and look how he turned out. But regardless, as time goes on, the patience Flanagan asks for from a genre that creates often overly eager audiences continues to grow. But that's a blessing for someone that's had his eye on him, technically, since I stumbled upon his short film version of Oculus months before I saw the feature film, neither which time I actually took notice of his name. I feel like I know Flanagan to a degree. He said a lot of what he puts in his films was just recreations of the things that scared him as a child. And it can't be a coincidence that he's also returning to these same themes over and over again, growing and evolving as he gains more life experiences. In Hill House, a ghost was a wish, a lingering feeling of discontent that controlled someone in grieving. That idea grew into something bigger that explored the gray area between love and possession, how the justification of love and grief alike can ultimately become self-consuming, to the point that the meaning is lost. But it's the moment that someone makes a selfless act, the moment someone listens to another without fear that their own self-interest is going to be damaged, that the healing process starts. Sometimes it ends in tragedy, but that's no excuse not to try. But unlike something like Life is Strange, it's not a story about saying goodbye to something as you're coming of age. It's a peeling back of the concept of death and grief in the horror genre. It doesn't present this innocent coming-of-age story and tell you instead to just accept the shit hand you've been given, where you can't go back and fix your mistakes. It tells you that the end you fear and dread isn't so permanent. We can love each other through lifetimes, across state lines, over years of being cut off. And that's what feels so incredibly provocative about it. I love Flanagan because the worlds he creates are so total-reaching, all-encompassing. Every background detail feels like it has 100 years of backstory. He's not the type to create a disjointed final product. He's not like a film student that can tell a compelling story, but just knows a few cool camera tricks or how to add fun neon and gel colors to a scene because he can. No, his camera movements are slow, meticulous, methodical in creating the larger-than-life spaces, making our characters feel incredibly small and insignificant. His lighting somehow blends these harsh, bleak shadows in with a low-contrast blue hue that feels like a faded photograph of something out of a dream. Every single facet of his directorial style complements his writing. They're not two separate entities, much like the yin and yang dynamic he's created between the steadfastness of love and the impermanence of anger. Both are necessary, sometimes even cyclical. You push so hard to do something for someone you love that you often drive them away, or in someone's absence you realize just how integral they were to your life. But whether you're speaking in moments or lifetimes, supernatural or mortal means, anger and regret isn't the end. Your last words are never truly that. It's not your fault for not answering the phone that last time, because you did so many times before. As we close, the last words of Eleanor Crane stick with me. Although I haven't read the original novel, I'm familiar enough with its contents to distinguish Jackson's words from Flanagan's original dialogue. While Jackson wrote pages upon pages, tying the ideas of fear and guilt together by sisterhood, saying fear is the relinquishment of logic, the willing relinquishing of reasonable patterns, how we yield to it or we fight it, but we cannot meet it halfway. Flanagan actually embodies that fear and guilt into a sister dynamic, and shows how, in practice, that relationship can ebb and flow, and can overtake and reshape one or the other. Besides her credit as a writer, Shirley Jackson lived as a repressed housewife, subservient to her husband Stanley Hyman and her 4 children. Hyman was often unfaithful, controlling, and abusive. It's clear that her work served as a reflection of her mental state at this time. She paints a picture of Hill House as a sort of trap, a gravity well, if you will, for despair and negative energy, and how it was destined to bring Eleanor into its trap from the start. To quote, "No living organism could continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids were supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood against itself, against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House. Whatever walked there, walked alone. I am home, she thought. I stopped in wonder at the thought. I am home. I am home, she thought. Now to climb. But in Flanagan's version, the context is completely different. Flanagan may have a knack for adaptation, but in between his pages and pages of interpretations is something truly his own, and something truly timeless. And if I hadn't known any better, I'd say Nell's last words were elegant enough to be handpicked from Jackson's original print. Although it has one distinction, an element of hope, Flanagan strips Hill House of its resentful origin. Unlike how Jackson was unable to separate her resentment towards the patriarchy from the world of the supernatural. Whereas with Jackson, those who walked Hill House walked alone. In Flanagan's world, they walked together. Flanagan's words for Nell are truly his own. A dead visage swallowed whole by a dead thing, yet continuing to look to the stars and speak of a future eternity as if it were unfolding all at once in front of her eyes. Talking about death, she says, "There's no without. I am not gone. I'm scattered into so many pieces, sprinkled onto others' lives like new snow. Forgiveness is warm, like a tear on a cheek. Think of that and of me when you stand in the rain."
I loved you completely. And you loved me the same. That's all. The rest is confetti.